Washington, D.C., 20001. We'll also take your calls at area code 202-626-4898. Gore Vidal has written many novels, plays, and essays varying from historical fiction to political commentary. His most recent book is called The Smithsonian Institution, a novel. Mr. Vidal was interviewed by Los Angeles Times book review editor Steve Wasserman about American society, writing, politics, and a number of other topics. This discussion takes place in the Writers Guild Theater in Beverly Hills, California. It lasts about an hour, 20 minutes.
Make sure your microphones are turned on. Yes.
This is a test. If I fail this test.
Good evening, and thank you for coming to tonight's Writer's Block program featuring Gore Vidal and Steve Wasserman. I'm Andrea Grossman, founder and president of Writer's Block. Writer's Block is dedicated to bringing to Los Angeles my favorite writers and artists and featuring them in interesting and provocative conversation in a setting such as this. Gore Vidal is celebrated for his intellectual and always provocative contribution to the national dialogue on any number of subjects, and I congratulate Steve Wasserman for furthering that dialogue. Before we get to tonight's program, I want to thank Cheryl Roden and the Board of Directors of the Writers Guild of America for making this theater available to us tonight. Thanks to my volunteers who keep Writer's Block going, to Beverly Fisher and Harvest Books, the proud publisher of Gore Vidal's book, The Smithsonian Institution. I thank Steve Wasserman for accepting the challenge of interviewing Gore Vidal, and of course, I am very grateful to Mr. Vidal for making Writer's Block one of his West Coast destinations. If you're not now on the mailing list and would like to hear about upcoming programs, please sign the mailing list sheet in the lobby. Upcoming Writer's Block programs include Carl Hyacin, William Safire, E.L. Doctorow, Bernhard Schlink, Evenings with the New Yorker featuring young fiction writers and regular contributors. Now for tonight. I scarcely know where to start in my comments about Gore Vidal because the sweep of his work, his accomplishments, and his influence are so far-reaching. He defies definition and classification on all fronts. He's a writer of novels, plays, essays, screenplays, a memoir, and has been the subject of documentaries here and abroad, has acted, launched 2 respectable runs for political office in New York and California, and more. Fairly remarkable for a guy who never went to college. He has always gone head-to-head and fist-to-fist with the establishment, regardless of whether or not that establishment is from the right or the left. I can't help wondering, not if, but how much, his famous political sparring with the likes of William F. Buckley and Jack Parr have influenced contemporary political campaign exercises. Let's look for a moment at Gore Vidal's brand of historical fiction. From Burr to Julian to the recently released The Smithsonian Institution, he turns the genre of historical fiction on its ear and makes historical fiction speculative fiction in the very best sense of the word. He takes historical figures, defies formula, and lets them go wherever they go. His fearless imagination rips through the past and delivers conclusions that continually challenge our belief systems. In these historical works, he takes on everything from monotheism, Christianity, and beloved icons of our national imagination, to name but a few. Like his politics, his literature is a constant surprise. He can make us see historical characters and events in ways that are different from how we always saw them. He accomplishes this because he extends our narrow and limited vision of our heroes of history. In short, he makes the familiar foreign and the foreign familiar. In a brief afterword in Burr, Vidal writes, quote, "Why a historical novel and not history? To me, the attraction of the historical novel is that one can be meticulous or as careless as the historian and yet reserve the right not only to rearrange events, but most important, to attribute motive, something the conscientious historian or biographer ought never do." He brings us within touching distance to American history. His books and he himself prove that we can be directly connected to historical figures from a century and a half ago. I love the story that a friend told me not long ago. In an interview, Gore had stated that he was only a handshake removed from Abraham Lincoln. When he was a child, he shook the hand of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who had in turn shaken the hand of Abe Lincoln. This would make all of us, in turn, only 2 handshakes removed from Lincoln. It should not be overlooked that the intermediary handshake was not just with anyone, but was with Oliver Wendell Holmes. I strongly urge you not all to get one step closer to Lincoln, by the way, by shaking his hand, because he's got to sign some books afterwards. Now for Steve Wasserman. I asked my friend Steve to interview Gore Vidal because such an interview requires an even playing field. An effective interviewer for our featured guest must possess great skill, intelligence, and a breadth of knowledge in literature, history, and politics. I know no one who is more fit for the task. Steve, like Gore, is a guy who is known for his politics and his command of literature. He has gracefully weathered and probably even enjoyed the completely ridiculous assertion by a right-wing political commentator recently that his book review is a grandstand for the left. As editor of the LA Times Book Review, Steve has resurrected that section of the paper with nods to all perspectives, and if he were allotted more than the 16 little pages he's given each week, we would have even more fun with it than we do. Besides being the former editorial director at Times Books and imprint of Random House, Steve has the most impressive Rolodex around and so graciously shares it with me whenever I ask. He's been extremely supportive of Writer's Block. For those of us who like to spend a perfect spring day at UCLA for the annual LA Times Festival of Books, we have Steve to thank for the festival's really terrific programs that just keep getting better and better. So this is what will happen tonight. Steve and Gore will talk. They might argue. Whatever they do, we will enjoy it. After they're finished, the audience can ask questions. And please use the microphones in the aisles for your questions. Gore Vidal will sign books for a brief and limited amount of time after the program. His latest book, The Smithsonian Institution, is on sale courtesy of Skylight Books in the lobby. Other books are available too. But he's here tonight especially for the Smithsonian Institution. Gore might find it amusing that he is being confused with his famous cousin, the vice president. Today I received a call from an enthusiastic young woman who breathlessly exclaimed, "I understand that Al Gore will be in Beverly Hills tonight speaking about his new book, Sexually Speaking." So, buy his books. He's here for that purpose and to visit with us, of course. And remember that we are hurtling quickly towards the holidays, and gifts are always required. Nothing beats a signed Gore Vidal book. So if you still haven't found that perfect holiday gift, look no further. And if you have, and he asks that if you have old books to sign, that you wait at the end of the line because he wants to sell his new books, as does his publisher. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Steve Wasserman and Gore Vidal.
Thank you, Andrea. Can everyone hear me? A little louder. All right, that won't be difficult to do. Thank you all for coming out and braving the traffic as one has to do in Los Angeles. It's always an hour everywhere from one's bedroom to one's bathroom, so thank you for coming early and packing the house. You know, what Vidal once said of Oscar Wilde applies equally to himself. He does not need explication or interpretation, despite the fact of a unusually long biography in a life that is mercifully still not over. He needs only to be read or listened to. So tonight we have an opportunity to listen to him, and every other night or even later you have an opportunity to read him, as I did earlier today when I departed Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. And if from time to time I look a bit stricken, it's because it's the only possible demeanor to adopt when one leaves the capital. But I can assure you that one thing is right. At Dulles International Airport, they do carry Mr. Vidal's works. And so, believing that it's important to support our writers, even successful writers, who can never be too successful in my judgment, I have purchased yet another copy of the Smithsonian Institution, which I do recommend to you. And one of the extraordinary things in reading this book, as the other books, is that it quickly becomes apparent that all of Gore Vidal's work, whether it has been the entertainments, the satirical entertainments like Duluth and Golgotha, or whether it's been the almost Balzacian series of historical novels, or of course the essays, is that all of the work seems unified by a thoroughgoing concern with where we have been as a people and as a republic, where we are today, how we got here, and where we might be going. And such an enterprise, only as Andrea has pointed out, 2 handshakes removed from the great Lincoln, is all the more paradoxical and perplexing since as a people we seem so given to social amnesia and forget that the history of the Republic is so recent, and yet our inability to remember so much of it so unfathomably vast. And so one of the curious things about reading Mr. Vidal's work is how the voice, so ironic, so confident, seems to have sprung like Athena, fully formed from the head of Zeus at so young an age. For example, just to give an example, you were 28 years old when you wrote in 1953, "The malady of civilized man is his knowledge of death. The good artist, like the wise man, addresses himself to life and invests with his private vision the deed and thought of men. The creation of a work of art, like an act of life, is our one small yes at the center of a vast no." On the eve of the Y2K and the turn of the millennial odometer, any reason to revise this view?
I think it's very beautiful, and I'd totally forgotten it. I'm going to stick around you if you've got enough of these quotations. I came here tonight in perfectly good faith in order to get my writer's block. I'd ordered one some years ago, but it never arrived, and I just kept on writing, you know. But tonight, I believe, you know, you're going to give me a very special block. I love the idea of Cousin Al having written Sexually Speaking. That's desperation. I mean, it's bad enough to have been the hero of Love Story and have Eric Siegel said, well, no, he wasn't, you know. But to have him going around, you know, holding up copies of Sexually Speaking, I think he's really in for the big time. I think he's got George W. on that one. I don't think we want to hear from George W. on it, but I think Albert he has refinement, you know. At the same time, you feel that Gore fire under him. The Gores, you know, are a very eccentric tribe out of the South. And with the exception of little Albert, they're generally rather witty, if somewhat crazy people. My grandfather was a Senator Gore, and his father was a Senator Gore. We had a cousin called Jeter Gore in Mississippi. Jeter was the greatest trial lawyer in the state. And very profane, drunk all the time in the courtroom, never lost a case. And his style went like this. He said, "Your Honor, if I was to ask you and this court to produce the 10 greatest sons of bitches in Mississippi, and you only sent me Trent Lott, I would not feel shortchanged." If only Albert would grasp the nettle. What was the question?
The question was, do you think Tipper is an enabler?
I think that she certainly, as far as the First Amendment went in her day, was an enabler, yes. I see something stricken and tragic in her face, and I don't know quite what it is. It may be a knowledge of history or the prison that the White House is. You see, it's nothing but perks they have. They have no power. And the Clintons had to find out the hard way because they really hadn't taken seriously the Yale Law School, which is the Vatican of our ruling class. And they'd gone to it, but they hadn't figured out that the country is owned by people with names like Mellon and Pew and Rockefeller, and that they are mere lawyers who serve as lobbyists or as president or in the Congress. Nobody told them that the country is run by the boardrooms. Richard M. Nixon, who knew a thing or two, he once said the United States doesn't really need a president domestically. A president is there for foreign affairs. Well, everybody thought that's Nixon being cynical and disliking the people, but it's wise. He knew that there was nothing you could do to change anything. You can't give the people health care. That money is supposed to go for the military. We get nothing back for the tax money. And what Nixon was saying, I understand this. The poor Clintons didn't understand it, and of course had their heads handed to them and learned a lesson. And I remember I discussed this with Mrs. Clinton, whom I very much admire. But I said, you know, why did you take so long? You took forever with this. It gave pharmaceuticals, it gave insurance companies, it gave some elements of the AMA the possibility of destroying you. They raised enough money to put on, remember the Harry and Lorraine ads? Harry, does this mean that we can't use kindly Dr. Haskins who delivered Buster Brown? I'm afraid, Lorraine, it does. Harry, that's communism. The money that the insurance companies and pharmaceuticals spent on those ads could have given us a health service for everybody in the country. So we're going through the quadrennial charade. Every 4 years, particularly people of my age who've been through a lot of these, we say it can't get any worse, you know? And 4 years later, it's worse. The system has worn out. I don't know what's next. Being a radical, I want to go back to Philadelphia and do another constitution. But they are persuading us, the media, that if you've just only got a really nice person, a nice man, nice woman, for president, everything will be all right, but it won't be, because we don't have nice corporations, and they have their own agenda.
You know, back in the mid-50s, C. Wright Mills wrote an interesting book called The Power Elite. There was one flaw in that book. He spent most of it writing from his armchair and never actually visited the country clubs or the golf courses or the
Bohemian Grove.
The Bohemian Groves. And I wonder if that establishment, which he so well described theoretically in the mid-50s, hasn't changed a good deal, and if the corporate and the military-industrial complex he was at pains to describe hasn't been eclipsed with something we know very well here in Los Angeles by something we might call the industrial entertainment complex.
Well, I don't think he could have predicted that, and who could have? That the United States, which was certainly a great exporter of food always, and still is pretty much, but we are mostly known for weapons and jet propulsion is our main source of revenue. That number two would now be entertainment, and well, we try to make entertaining, and that would be such a big business and have so many interesting levels, because you are getting into people's brains with even the worst TV that you export is going to have repercussions. Oh, admittedly, I'm not going to say a word against atomic weapons because I love them. We all brought up to love them, you know, and they make big holes and a lot of radiation. They're very exciting. And we should sell more and more of them, too, to developing countries, you know, so that they can stand tall, the way we stand tall. I don't know how C. Wright Mills would have put that in. I think he probably would have done a riff on the genius of the American rulers in discovering not only did we make entertainment in such a fashion that the whole world wanted it, no matter how bad it might be, we did it better than anybody. And through that, we turned them into Americans. And that, if you're in a ruling class situation and a world empire, I think it was Clinton who said, we are Mrs. Albright, we are the only indisposable nation. Well, that immediately made me think, well, why can't we dispose of it? You know, I mean, what's so great about being indisposable? It sounds like, you've got some terrible disease. But indeed, we have briefly got the world. And I say briefly because as soon as the market crashes, there goes the world flying off in all different directions. And meanwhile, they're working out now. I think we have to have a war with China. I think that's probably next.
Well, before we have that war, we just signed a deal with China today, which ensures that China will never be able to feed its own population because they're going to have to buy our wheat. That was the deal that was struck
genetically
today.
Altered, too.
Genetically altered, that's right. It will save them the cost of thousands, millions of dollars to alter, on cosmetic surgeries to alter the shape of their eyes, which is probably next up on the agenda.
I went in the Army at 17 in the war, 1943, I think it was. And we were assured, as of Pearl Harbor and up until about 42, we had indoctrination courses, and one was we had nothing to fear from the Japanese. Because of the configuration of their eyes, they could not handle modern aircraft. Then they sank our fleet at Pearl Harbor. So we kept trying to explain that. We also had an indoctrination course on how to tell Japanese from Chinese, because the Chinese were good Asians and the Japanese were the enemy. So I was at an indoctrination course, and an officer there with a ruler in his hand, and there were two life-size cutouts, one of a naked Japanese boy and one of a Chinese. The Chinese was tall, willowy, and beautiful, because he was our friend. The Japanese was he looked like one of those awful Mickey Rooney numbers that grayer heads will remember along with me. He was just awful looking, thick glasses, buck teeth. And the guy is telling the difference. In case you come across on an island, you don't know whether it's a Chinese ally or a Japanese. Notice the the legs of the Japanese. They are buck and buck teeth. And he said the main difference, now notice this carefully. Here we are, 500 kids sitting there, bemused. The difference in pubic hair. The Japanese are wiry and thick, and the Chinese are long and thin. And I alone stood up, as is my wont, and I said, how do we persuade them to reveal if they are friend or foe?
And how did you?
Never laid eyes on either.
You were immediately banished to the Aleutian Islands.
I was sent to the Aleutian Islands, where I learned the difference between ravens and seals. But
pubic hair.
No, it was the eyes. Is this going all right for you?
It's going. It's.
I haven't got to my economic program.
I can't wait to get to the economic program, but I think a detour to the national security state is in order. But
Right.
before getting there, it is a paradox of the manner in which the American imperium has entangled itself with the globe at the very moment we're becoming more and more provincial as a people. Fewer books are being translated today from other languages than was the case 30 years ago.
Well, I think it's we begin with a pretty bad educational system. Certainly the public system is bad. We have the transfer in attention from books. We're a post-literary culture. We're an audio-visual culture. Kids, they do video games. They don't read books. So I'm told that the Potter books are making some progress with the young. But if you don't start to read very early in life, you never will. And if these examples are not held up to you, you won't. We killed off the educational system, which was pretty good in the 30s, the 40s. By the 50s, when we were having immortal longings as an empire, all the money went to the Pentagon. It was a militarized economy, and we let the public schools go. And I always thought that C. Wright Mills and I often thought alike. It's not that we see conspiracies. Our rulers do not conspire. They all think alike. That's how they get the jobs at the New York Times or in the White House. They think alike. Would you want, if you were running the country and selling them cigarettes and Richard Nixon, would you want them to be intelligent? Well, you can't stop that. Intelligence is innate, and but you can make them ignorant by not telling them anything. Every year, Purdue does a study on what are the most popular subjects in schools, and the high school students, number 30, which is the bottom, is American history. Now, how you make that boring, I don't know. Now, you may tell me that I have made it boring, but I don't think I have, and I certainly have never been bored by it. To remove a nation's past from it, their excuse was, well, we've got all these new people coming in because we're the greatest nation on earth, and everybody wants to live here. And I said, yeah, everybody from Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, every country we wrecked down south, they're getting their revenge. They're coming back to what they call the occupied lands of California. Can't blame them. When was the last time you saw a Swedish immigrant in the United States? They prefer their health care system. But the press exists to badmouth other societies. Yes, they'll say the Swedes have education for everybody, health care for everybody, daycare centers for working mothers, but they all get drunk and commit suicide. Because that's what happens if you're well educated and have a medical service. And to watch the people year after year go out and vote against their own interests is one of the jewels in our democratic diadem. It is just horrifying.
Of course, fewer and fewer people are actually voting. So
well, we're not
the numbers voting against their own
Earth.
interests is a diminishing band given the actual number of eligible voters.
Well, it would seem to be, yes. Government workers do vote. That's the civil and urban. No, everybody knows it's a con game. Everybody knows that we have one political party, which is the party of property, with two right wings, one called Democrat, one called Republican, and the same people pay for each. So what are you voting for?
Now, you've developed some reputation, at least some of your critics think you have some reputation of being a bit of a neo-isolationist with regard to the United States. And given the fact that you have a view of the two parties being one party, this might be a good opportunity to distinguish that position from, say, the positions of Pat Buchanan.
Well, I must say, he can't be wrong all the time. And I was amazed. He's a careful reader of mine. I've known this in the past. And I'm
alarmed to hear so.
Well, it's rather thrilling. And he has taken against the American empire because he sees there's nothing in it for the people at large. He has tapped, this is only in the last year and a half, I mean, sheer opportunism, but who cares what the motive is. There is a great hole in our life, and that is for a candidate who represents the people of the country. There's nobody out there who will come anywhere near it.
Not Donald Trump.
Well, he might in ways that we don't understand, but no, he does not. Now, Buchanan has tapped into a populist feeling. The United States the people were never instinctively expansionist after we filled up the continent. At the time of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt was desperately trying to get us into the war on the side of England and France against Hitler. 80% of the American people, the day before the bombs fell at Pearl Harbor, were against the United States entry into World War II. That's 80%. And Roosevelt maneuvered matters in such a way, this is in my new book, The Golden Age. I've done a lot of research on this, and they were maneuvered into attacking us. He didn't think it would be such a big and dreadful attack. But that got us into the war, which he wanted. So you have a people that wants to mind its own business. It does not want to be sent off to fight in countries they've never heard of. Vietnam certainly demonstrated the idiocy of our rulers in fighting and fighting and fighting for nothing. Word gets around. So everybody's disgusted with the political system. Nobody sees an alternative. Buchanan, taking up some of my lines the way 8 years ago, Jerry Brown was borrowing my speeches. And I went on television. I said, I'm so happy that Jerry is doing so well with them, And immediately, he's shameless. I got a call from him. He said, do you have any more? Well, I'm perfectly willing to give some more to Pat Buchanan. However, he is he's basically not only unelectable, but one wouldn't want to see him anywhere in power. He has sworn fealty to the fetus and the flag, and he has shown disdain for the Jew and the fag. I'm in my Bulworth mood now.
Any comment on Forbes or McCain?
Forbes looks as though his father's money just hit him on the head. And he's got this stunned look. And, or a bit like what they used to say of Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford looked like the first guy in the science fiction picture who sees the monster. Equally dazed. Oh, we have a rare group out there. Now my sensitive friends in New York, the old liberal establishment, who've done so much harm to the country. Have you read that book on the Bundy brothers, The Color of Truth?
By Kai Bird, yes.
Kai Bird, it's a great book. I highly recommend it too. It's really how we got into Vietnam. With these two Groton Yaleys, with a great condescension toward the American people, rather great dislike for them. They're just grinding this war on and on. But to watch this thing go out of control, it reminded me of something that I just heard General Eisenhower's voice, and when I hear his voice, I lose my train of thought. And
that didn't happen to you just before writing Myra Breckinridge, did it?
No, it happened afterwards. And in a true democracy, there is no place for a difference of opinion on great issues. But then, to cap that, Richard M. Nixon, I just read in your paper, or some paper, no, I guess it was the New York Times, that I'm alleged to have no conscious mind.
That was the New York Times.
Well, one of those papers. But I remember something that Nixon wrote in Six Crises. And he said, General Eisenhower was a far more sly and devious man than people suspected, and I mean those words in their very best sense. That's no conscious mind.
You've missed your calling.
You called and I came.
Why, with the audience for serious literature so eviscerated by the amnesiacs that so much people the country, and why, with your own steadfast devotion to history, in a time when more and more to be found throughout the land is illiteracy, why have you doggedly turned out one book after another? What keeps you going?
Stupidity? I feel I have a utilitarian mind, without being Jeremy Bentham's direct descendant, and I believe that literature must serve a function. other than that of parading the author's personality and what happened last summer at Ann Arbor when he met the exchange student Moira from England, and his wife left him and he didn't get tenure, and the autistic child. It was a tragic story, you know. And these are the books about victims, which are most of the books that are written these days by would-be novelists, popular novelists. I always thought, I remember something Mary McCarthy said, you know, she was tough as nails, but she was very, very bright. She said, well, if nothing else from War and Peace, there is a wonderful recipe for strawberry jam. Well, I'm just providing recipes for things. And sometimes I provide a recipe for how to get rid of an empire and replace it with a republic, because I'm reactionary, of course. So I have persisted in literature and in telling the story of my country to the people at large, because I think somebody's got to do it. If we'd had a proper educational system, I would not have had to do it. And I never went to public school. I went to private schools. And you're quite right, I never went to college. But I went through Exeter, which was a good school in those days, and I suppose still is. We were served the same nonsense the public schools are. I mean, it's not as simplistic, but we were given a worldview that had absolutely no relation to American history. Even I, at 14, noted with some dawning irony that the author of the American history book that we were given to study was called a Muzzy, characteristic name for an Exeter historian. Our history's been kept from us, and I like digging around, finding out about it, and then I pass it along. I wrote a book called Creation, which if I were a dictator, I'd force everybody in the United States to read. And not for my royalties, and not for my glory. I'd sign it, somebody else's name to it. It's the 5th century BC. One man, had he lived to be 75, could have met Zoroaster, the Buddha, Socrates, and Confucius, who became sort of my hero in the writing of it. That book is a crash course in comparative religion, a crash course in comparative systems. Everything was happening intellectually in the 5th century BC. Nobody's ever going to tell anybody this in the United States. You're never going to get anywhere unless you take a highly specialized course at Harvard, which makes you then unemployable in any field open. So I do these things first to teach myself, and then I write them down and I pass them along, hoping that others will read them. Between me and the public stands a wall of such idiocy, the media, that they will let nothing intelligent by, nothing useful can get through. If it doesn't serve, you know, our rulers, who are perfectly happy for us to know nothing at all. I love Robert McNamara finally confessing, well, I didn't really understand the Vietnam War. Well, I didn't understand him with those great vacant eyes and those huge spectacles and that slick down hair. And I knew he knew nothing, but I didn't have any proof. And then he gives it to us. Well, he didn't get it. I used to go on television those years, and I argued with everybody in the administration. I was against the war, needless to say. People like Congressman Judd of Illinois, I can remember him. He was a missionary. There were always missionary sons. And Henry Luce was a missionary son in China. Watch out for them. And I'd go on and I'd say, well, do you understand about the Buddhists? Well, you know, I might just as well have said the Pelagian heresy will never take place in Lower Provence. I mean, it was beyond anybody's grasp. So I learned to talk like Cousin Albert for a long time. I said things very slowly. And if you listen, you will find out something. Doesn't work either, but anyway.
Well, our rulers have read you very closely, as I had occasion to learn a few years ago when, prior to accepting this post at the Los Angeles Times, I was, for a period of years, editorial director of a an imprint at Random House. It's an aspect of publishing that I learned 2 days ago no longer exists. The Bertelsmann people, the German overseers, have tossed it down the memory chute. But in any event, in that capacity, there came one day to visit me Robert M. Gates. You'll recall him as the former head of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he came to me wanting to talk about a book he wanted to write once he'd left his high office. But there was one small problem. He couldn't set down in a proposal, a proper proposal, the book he would write, because he said it was all classified. I said, well, is there any previous writing that I might look at to get a sense of your style? And he said, no, unfortunately, all he had written over the years were memoranda of various kinds, and they were all classified. I said, well, could we talk about the sorts of subjects you might consider in this work of yours? And he said, well, we could, but most of them are classified. And I said, well, desperate to get some sense of the book that he would write, I asked, well, are there any writers that you admire, any previously published books that would serve as a model of the sort of book you would like to write? And he thought for a moment. He said, yes, there are two. And I said, well, let's begin with one first. Rousseau's Confessions. I thought, well, that's beginning. And then I asked him, anything more recent? To my surprise, he said, well, yes, Gore Vidal's Lincoln. My turn to be very surprised. I said, whatever was it about Vidal's Lincoln that you so much admired? He said, well, I've served under a number of presidents, and I have found no historical account of those presidents to be really compelling. And Vidal's description of the pressures put upon Lincoln, I found wholly convincing. And from this, I discovered where the Reaganites got the idea for lifting the writ of habeas corpus. They stole it from your book.
Well, I'll tell you why they liked it, the right wing.
Even Reagan claimed to have read it.
Reagan claimed to have read it, which of course was untrue, but I think he had finished coloring it, but I'll tell you who did read it. And I was on television in Washington with a fat young congressman about the time Lincoln came out, which was 84, 85. It was Newt Gingrich. And he said, you know, I disapprove of you. So I said, yes, I know. And if I knew who you were, I'd disapprove of you too. But he said, I want you to know, and he told the TV audience, he said, this is the best book about American president that I have ever read. And I read and reread it. It's partly, it is how he achieved total power without anybody knowing it. And I thought, oh boy, this is the right wing. They really want a dictatorship of some kind, but with a nice folksy figure like Lincoln, who seems harmless. And Nixon, Lincoln ended up suspending habeas corpus, throwing out the First Amendment, locking up people. He did terrible things in the military necessity, was the phrase, and one good thing, which was the freeing of the slaves. I remember the campaign in which Mondale was running against Carter. Mondale, wasn't it, against, they're such a blur now. Against who? Yeah, no. Anyway, it was it was the election after '84. No, it was after McGovern. Anyway, it was after Lincoln came out, which is 1984. Every presidential candidate claimed to have read it. Fritz Mondale took a weekend off in the campaign to finish reading it, he said, and he actually did, which is why he lost. That was when Ronald Reagan told, he was president then, this must have been when Gerald Ford was running against Carter. Reagan said, well, it's full of mistakes, you know. And even Hugh Sidey at Time magazine, a man who never saw a president he could not worship, and really worshipped Reagan, said, well, in what way is it inaccurate? Reagan said, well, Vidal has this scene where President Lincoln watches the sun rise from the Oval Office. You can't see the sunrise. So Hugh Sidey rang me at the time, and he said, now, President Reagan has just told me this story. And I said, well, congratulate him, because he was supposed to sleep quite late in the morning and have an afternoon nap as well. I didn't know that he was burning the morning oil, much less the midnight oil, in the Oval Office. But tell him with my compliments that Lincoln ceased to be president in 1865. A rather notorious moment. And the Oval Office was not built until 1905 by Theodore Roosevelt. Story never ran.
These are among the facts you will not encounter in Dutch by Edmund Morris.
Oh, poor Edmund Morris, my God. I warned him. He told me he'd got this marvelous job and that he'd have total access and sit in on meetings. And I said, you know, there are a couple of things you must watch out for. One is, this is the most boring man that ever drew breath. The nicest man that you'll ever meet, but he is a crash. We called him Chester Chatterbox. He just can't stop talking. And he tells funny stories that he gets from the Reader's Digest in those days and the Saturday Evening Post. And he recites them with wonderful timing. But I have seen strong men, you know, faint to the floor. I've seen powerful women defenestrate themselves rather than be bored by this man. I can use foul language like defenestrate here. I mean, that's all right. I said, you've got that problem. And second, there is no way that you can understand Reagan unless you understand the studio system in this town. And I was the last contract writer at MGM. So I have been part of the studio system. And I know that they were indentured servants, the actors. They looked very glamorous and were very famous. But they didn't make any money until the studios broke up. They were rather small incomes. And they were treated like puppets and like slaves. They were ordered around. Hit your mark, Ron. That's all he ever heard. And he was very good at hitting his mark. He was a very obedient actor who never complained. So I said, you've got to learn how the studio system worked. He keeps going on in the book about how Reagan doesn't have any friends and has no interest in people. Well, he does, but Morris doesn't know what interests him. All Reagan ever wanted out of life was to be Glenn Ford. His ambitions never went higher. Other people kept pushing him up and up and up. And he'd be sitting there looking at Glenn Ford's, you know, latest credits and grinding his teeth. That was a real star. I said, if you want to get him on subjects, I said, talk about acting, talk about, you see, but Morris didn't know anything about that period. I said, get him, when he's president of the Screen Actors Guild, I said, what he really likes to do is reminisce. This is when he was all together. And he said, I remember the Ida Lupino contract of 1936. No, I'm wrong. It was 37. And I went in to Jack Warner. I always called him Mr. Warner. He was the greatest man that I have ever met in my entire life. Here's somebody who had met Roosevelt, you know. But Jack Warner was the greatest man. And, you know, 5 hours later, we're still down to whether or not she gets permission to cross out the pictures of herself for publicity that she doesn't like. That's what interests him. The fact that he showed no interest in politics means he has none. Now, why not grasp this simple fact? He understands the mechanics of politics. He understands presentation. And I said, never fall for the number which the right wing sold everybody, that he was a grade B actor, that he was a bad actor. He was a first-rate actor. He was, I think, the number 5 box office star in the U.S. when he went into the Army, put on his uniform, and bravely went over from Burbank to Culver City. A lot of guts.
We're going to take some questions now from the audience. So if you would like to There are 2 microphones, one on either side, and if the please keep your question brief and make it a question. And if you cannot hear the question, I will repeat it.
What could induce you to run for the presidency, perhaps with Jesse Ventura as your running mate?
I don't think the country's ready for us. I'd have to learn more wrestling, and he would have to, I don't know, watch that feather boa, I suppose. Something could happen from something weird like that. But I am far too old, and he's overweight, you know. I love Grover Cleveland, but I don't think we could have that weight in the White House now. But somebody from the radical, somebody who represents the 80% of the people who don't have any money could have a huge audience, and the people would vote.
I don't know if you remember back in 1980, we had a political party called the Citizens Party. We tried to be a third party, and you were involved, and that's when we met last, I think. Studs Terkel and Barry Commoner, a whole lot of good people. Remember Studs called the political system, he called them the Republicrats, as you said, it's one party. He called them one party, the Republicrats, and we wanted to come up with another party with another name. We did very badly in the election, if you remember. Do you think there is a possibility now, even now, or were you totally turned off to a third party idea because of that debacle? Do you think it's possible to have a third party in this country that could do anything, mean anything?
Well, essentially it's a one-party nation, and the people who pay for it, everybody's in on this. Everybody gets a slice of the pie, starting with the networks. They don't want to change any of this. They get billions of dollars in these elections. So there is no move to change to a second party, a third party, a fourth party, whatever. They're doing too well out of it. There's too much money swirling around. That won't change until there isn't that much money around and until people are really angry at what's been done to them. And this is more a matter of education. My mentor in politics was Eleanor Roosevelt, and she always said, if you take the time to explain what you mean to the people, they get the point, and they will vote for their interest. But she said it's tedious. Many people don't like doing it. She learned how to do it, and it was very difficult because she had a terrible voice, and Roosevelt was very good at it, but very cautious. You need educators out there, and this is more apt to come from interested groups and things. Whether it's environment or this or that, that's the flag. But under that, there should be the thought this system cannot endure. Everyone hates it, except the 1% who do very well by it. And say, like the interviewer from the New York Times who came to me a few years, Mr. Vidal, this is a little lady there, and said, you really hate the American people, don't you? And I said, no, I hate the New York Times, and it's not the same thing.
I believe it's reprinted in Sexually Speaking, a conversation that you had a few years ago with a very learned rabbi, Larry Kramer. And the subject of Abraham Lincoln came up, and I believe, if I recall correctly, he chided you for not getting to the real inside story of Abraham Lincoln, and more recently he threatened to tell it and then maybe change his mind or something. Do you think this would be a subject for a further book, or perhaps a film for Leonardo DiCaprio and Seth Green?
Well, you leave me shaken. I mean, not to mention Mount Rushmore is just split down the center. Everybody who studied Lincoln thinks that there's probably something in this relationship between Joshua Speed, a handsome young man, fellow lawyer from Kentucky, and they shared the same bed in Springfield, which was an innocent thing to do in those days, but might not have been. And there are mysteries about Lincoln. He was a man without friends. There are no lady friends. I think much of Anne Rutledge was probably invented by William Herndon, his law partner, to try and make him seem more like a regular fellow, because he walked alone. And the nearest things to love letters are the strange letters between him and Speed, particularly at the time when each got married. And Lincoln isn't liking the idea one bit and is dreading it. And Speed is rather more robust, so it's perfectly all right, you know, you've got the knack of it. And it's odd exchange. I am the only writer in America, of course, who could not use this. So I leave it to you or to Larry Kramer, who is silent on the subject because he doesn't know much about it, but it's interesting.
Could you solve a problem for me? I've been racking my brains since Time came out with a book on the 100 greatest Americans or people in the world, and one of them was Ronald Reagan. And
no.
Yes, the only reason I could possibly think, having thought about this for some years, as to why they would choose him is because I think, you know, well, we know the reasons why we don't think he was one of the top 100 people in the century, but is because, you know, of the breakdown of the end of the Cold War. So I'd just like to know how much you think he was responsible for it, since anyone with half a brain, and that probably means Gorbachev and Thatcher and others, who would work out that, you know, America getting Star Wars certainly wouldn't solve the problem of itinerant other nations lopping bombs at us. How much did Ronald Reagan have responsibility for the end of the Cold War in your opinion?
I don't think he had any.
Good, thank you very much.
I was in Moscow in 1987. Gorbachev held a plenum in the Kremlin, and they had 700 worthies from around the world, and none of us communists, but all of us anti-nuclear, which was ostensibly what the meeting was about. Everybody was there, from Trudeau to Norman Mailer and me and Graham Greene. Just to stick to the literary side, it was a fascinating group, and Gorbachev was extraordinary. And he began his speech he said, you know, Chernobyl frightened us. This is a few months afterwards. I've never heard an American president since Franklin Roosevelt say anything frightened us. I mean, we're a super race. There was a famous day when Roosevelt said, tonight the news is all bad. Can you imagine an American president saying that? We just lost Singapore, we just lost Java, and half the fleet was gone, and he leveled.
Look what happened to Jimmy Carter when he just confessed to a malaise.
Well, look what happened when Jimmy Carter, I was with Frank Church, who was a very witty senator, and he is much missed and died too early. But I was with Frank Church when Jimmy Carter said, and if I'm elected president, I will never lie to you. And Frank Church said he will deny the very nature of politics.
Mr. Vidal, if, like Lucius Cornelius Sulla, you were appointed dictator for life, how would you start to change the system?
I would probably deconstruct the Pentagon. I would restore that ugly building at Langley, Virginia, to lovely green fields again. I would curtail the FBI and its files, not to mention the LAPD and its files, on ordinary citizens. I would enact privacy laws and enforce them. The constant harassment of the American people, which I see year by year and living out of the country part of the year, it's more vivid to me coming back. The questions, you see, we've got 2 wars on terrorism and drugs. Well, drugs should be legalized, then you wouldn't have to have a war on them. And we don't have much terrorism, considering how much we provoke other people by blowing them up. I still don't understand why a patriotic Panamanian has not taken out the Capitol. I'm not going, don't repeat that I said this, you know, because there may be such a Panamanian. But you can't go on treating other people like dirt and expect not to get something kicked in your face.
Would you abolish Congress?
It's done itself. They are simply there to serve the corporations that paid for their elections. And they do a good job of that. After all, this is a nation of lawyers, and between the lobbyist lawyers who work to undo the laws, which are done by the congressional lawyers, which so make the laws that they're easily undone in order to serve the great corporations, it's circular and very effective for them. The fact that the people have been left out of the equation hasn't caused any distress anywhere. Be interesting to see the press write about that.
You've lived in Italy for over 30 years, I think, on and off, but you never really talk about it very much. So my question is, why Italy, and have you become a public figure there? And what's Warren Beatty up to?
I'm not sure that the synapses of my brain can quite hold Warren and Italy together, but I'll do my best. Actually, I have a house in the Hollywood Hills, and I have a house in Italy where I write. So, arguably, I don't live in America at all. Now, that's the laugh I get in San Francisco. I have nothing much to say about Italy. It's a place where I have a beautiful house and a great library, and where I work. What I like about the Italians, and the Vidal side of my family is Italian from the Veneto, up north of Venice, is it's pre-Christian, always a joy for me. While Northern Europe is post-Christian, a greater joy for me. And then I come back here. I will be tactful on that subject. But monotheism is the greatest disaster ever to have befallen the West. It has done nothing but harm. It's created a family structure that it's fills psychiatrist's office, not to mention the bookshelves of a great nation with sad tales of misunderstood children. I don't know what Warren's doing.
Considering what Donald Trump was saying last week about taxing the super rich, if he gains in popularity, would you care to predict whether he'll be dodging a bullet? And you once also said that Ralph Nader was the one that American people trusted and who should run for president. Was he uninterested, or was he afraid for his safety?
No, I was just dumb then. I hadn't realized that he never follows through on anything. So, but that was in 1964 that I ran him for president on the cover of Esquire. That's where he stayed, actually. I don't think Mr. Trump is sincere about taxing the rich. Something tells me, I don't know. I have these extraordinary antennae at times, and I just don't see him being sincere.
Hello. My question is a two-parter. My first one is, what are your feelings on the criminal justice system and how it's failing to produce justice in America? And my second question has to do with education and the production of jails in America, and how to reverse the disastrous cycle of creating more jails and getting rid of schools. And the less schools we have, the more jails we have. I was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit.
A question to do with what Mr. Vidal thinks of the criminal justice system and the ways in which it reproduces itself.
Well, the latest statistic, which stunned me, I hope it was a misprint, but it was in the New York Times, is that there are 4.9 million Americans in prison, on parole, under surveillance, and I thought it was just the standard 2 million in prison, which is the most of any country, but apparently more people are under direct observation and surveillance. They have these bracelets now, quite attractive, I'm told, that you can wear, which will, somebody sitting at a central monitor will know where you are and can keep track of you. This is the police state that every aggressive government has always dreamed of, and modern technology has made it a reality for us. The privatization of prisons is one of the most sinister developments of the last 10 years. There's a lot of money in it. And people are going into it to rip off. It is no good for the prisoners, most of whom should not be in prison. They're there for being arrested 3 times with a joint. Victimless crimes are a real specialty for Americans. And it goes back to monotheism. You see, we hate sin. We really do. And we want sinful people put away. So we make civil laws which are then put in place in order that our religious bigotries can be enacted. We create prohibitions of a sexual nature, dietary nature, in order to control the population. And it is a reign of terror going on. The blacks are the first to get the good of it, and they know perfectly well. One of the stunts why, aside from the hatred of the blacks, which is about the only thing that holds the whites together in the United States, is that they are, by putting them in jail, first of all, it satisfies all the whites. Secondly, it disenfranchises them. They can't vote. So if you do that to enough of them, young black men, let us say, which is a specialty of the police departments, you have removed millions of potential voters who would support a party of the sort that your previous person standing there was advocating. So it's very clever. But I don't want to live in a police country. And the Norwegians sent over a group of penologists to take a look at our prisons, and they thought Uganda was slightly better. I mean, we really are one of the most loathed countries on earth. And it never gets through because the press is not going to report it. And it'll never be shown. We're always envied. And the Swedes are still committing suicide.
Thank you.
A pleasure. Where do you draw your inspiration from, and has that changed over time? And what figures, modern figures, if any, do you admire and why? And do you have a perspective on where the internet's taking us?
Well, I have a pretty good recipe for strawberry jam, you know. I don't know where the internet is going to go, but I know the government is going to try to take it over. You can count on that. So that will be a great war for the next 10, 20, 30 years. Where do I draw inspiration from? An outraged sense of justice. I have an exaggerated one. And I remember in school, I used to get annoyed when certain laws were laid down for me. We have perfect freedom of speech. Don't say damn. I mean, that was one. Nobody saw the illogic of it. I would naturally point out the illogic of it. It became beloved at Exeter for this trait. Of living people that I have admired, the only writer of our time that I could say that I really deeply admired and brought him to the attention of the English-speaking people was Italo Calvino. He's a very great writer and well worth anyone's study, and I've certainly given him a lot of study.
Hi, given your feelings about monotheistic religions, I wonder if you would comment on Moses's presidency of the NRA.
You mean Charlton Heston? I would have kept him up there on that mountain.
It was he who coined that phrase, every time I hear the word culture, I reach for my revolver.
Yes, well, actually, that was Joseph Goebbels, one of his better lines. Yeah. But Charlton's an actor, you know, and they take whatever they can find. No, he's keeping busy, you know, and I can't tell how dumb he is. I worked with him on Ben-Hur. He now pretends I wasn't even on the picture. Well, I was. This dread biography of me, which I have not read, but it has a lot of detail about the 3 months that I was in Rome and working on the script, and all the awful things that we said about Chuck, the producer, in his letters to me, and Willie Wyler. And he was everybody's last choice. Nobody wanted him. Paul Newman was #1, and Paul turned it down. And he just acted in something called The Silver Chalice, and he said, "I'm never going to act in a silver cocktail dress again." And I said, "Why, it makes you look like a girl?" "No," he said, "I have bad legs." So he could not even have done Some Like It Hot. So the last choice, they had an open call for actors at Metro, and Vic Damone tried out for it. And finally, Willie Wilder had worked with Heston is a wonderful villain, and he'd some Western. And Wilder said to Sam, they were desperate. They'd already built downtown Jerusalem in the first century, and they were starting to build Charlton Heston. You know, they had all that balsa wood left over, and so he got the job. But he was nobody's first choice. He used to have in his house, when you rang the doorbell, the chimes played the theme song from Ben-Hur. They don't build them like that anymore.
Which works, literary or otherwise, have been most important to you aesthetically during your life, and what books do you return to over the years?
I suppose I turned to, I think the book that most impressed me in my early middle age was Montaigne. And I continue to reread him, and he is the perfect essayist, and I am convinced that probably what little literature there will be in the future, and there isn't going to be much, I think the novel has had it, as poetry has had it, except coincidentally, we've never had better poets than we have now. We just don't have good readers. And the same thing is happening to the serious novel. The essay will always be read because it's one person talking to you. It's one person writing. One person, Montaigne picks up Cicero and reads a passage on death and what philosophy should be about. And he says, Plato's got it wrong. He said, Plato says that philosophy is to prepare you for death. Well, he says that is palpably untrue and worthless even if it is. It prepares you for life. And then you have a great essay, just starting with the hook of something Plato wrote. Well, when you read that sort of thing, over the centuries, the voice of Montaigne is speaking to you. And back of him, there is the voice of Plato, over a couple of millennia speaking to you. And you are the sole recipient. And it's the kinetic energy between the type on the page and your eye and your brain. And that is the highest communion aesthetically that I can think of, certainly intellectually. Theater can sometimes rise to these heights. And poetry, when it was read, I mean, I can still read Milton with great excitement, even more than I do reading Shakespeare. But each has his list.
Given the recent consolidations that have taken place within the corporate media and the concentration of power in the media, what does that mean for the future of America?
Well, I should think homogenization of everything, the lowering of standards in everything. In publishing, it is known now as dumbing down. And we have a whole set of new editors who have been dumbed down by either their gene pool or by their educational system or just lucky, talent scouts who find them. And it's never been dumber. I should think that the bigger anything gets, the worse it gets. That has been my experience and the experience of everybody in this room. As soon as you have Mother's Bloor's chocolate pie, which she makes in her kitchen in Detroit, and then somebody buys her out, and then it's Mother Bloor's pie, and the first thing they do, they take the chocolate out. It's too expensive. They take out the real eggs, they put in dried eggs. That's too expensive. They take this out and that out. And by the time it is international, I mean, you're eating sawdust called Mother Bloor's chocolate pie. That is the nature of capitalism. Now I've said it.
I'm wondering if you think that before the government takes control of the internet, that perhaps the American people might be able to harness it for our own political advantage. If there is an internet, grassroots internet campaign for a write-in candidate for president, who would your first choice be?
No, nobody I've ever heard of. I mean, we're not allowed to hear about these people. Now, there's somebody who's also in my line of work, at least when I'm in demagogic mode, is Noam Chomsky, and we do the same kind of thing. And they won't mention him in the press. I mean, he's just black. I don't think he's appeared in the New York Times, except maybe under linguistics, for his entire career. He's a non-person. That is what we do with critics of the society. Let's say we had a really charismatic presidential candidate, the way in '88, I think it was, Jesse Jackson was. Well, they knocked him off in no time at all. But once he took the Michigan primary, that was the end of Jesse. Nobody's going to change this system. I mean, that's a given. They'll find some way of doing them in. So if you have a write-in candidate and you have millions of people around the country, they don't know enough names to put up there. So you're probably going to get Leonard DiCaprio, is that his name? Might be a very good president, you know. He looks thoughtful.
We'll take four more questions, 2 on this side and 2 on the next.
A lot of what you've been saying has seemed to pertain to the United States less than to the rest of the world. Something which troubles me is that as I look around, the model, the worldview that is ours and is more and more the world's, is the worldview of a machine, of society as a machine, of schools as machines, corporations as machines, rather than as biology or nature or living systems. It seems to me that back when we thought the Earth was the center of the universe, we didn't know better. But it seems like if you look around, one would know better. What accounts for the powerful spell of that machine worldview, and do you see any hope for it changing?
Well, follow the money. The money does not want us to know about the rest of the world, and it wants to frighten the rest of the world in buying our weapons and our entertainment and so on. There's never been a time in which there is so much, kind of phony information going on and nothing of any great value. And how does anybody get a world view if they only have a bit of paper here and a bit of paper there? You can educate yourself, but most people don't have the time. And you're asking either for a new sort of human race. My misanthropic grandfather, Senator Gore, one of his favorite lines, he said, if there was any race other than the human race, I would go join it. That's, now as Nixon would say, that's the easy way.
Mr. Vidal, I had a question. In your opinion, is American wit dead or dying? And the other half of my question is, if we are all 2 handshakes away from Lincoln, may I have mine now?
You may have yours now. American humor, well, I love the airplane pictures. They don't make them now, but... and Captain Frank Dearden, or whatever he's called, is Leslie Nielsen is, I think, the funniest man on earth. My first television play, he was this thin, blonde young man from Canada, very handsome. And I never dreamed that he would have taken my place on the screen. A little bitterness. The best of American humor in my lifetime was Jewish humor, and it was immigrant humor first, and then got more polished. And I think rose to a great peak with the early Woody Allen, and then somebody took him to an Ingmar Bergman picture. But he still comes back to us from time to time, and he's the only auteur we have.
At the end of November, about 100,000 people from all over the world are going to Seattle to descend on the World Trade Organization, and they're planning to shut it down. Any comments on the WTO?
None. I have not thought about it. I just noticed that recently. I am on my way to Seattle, and I will do my best to keep it open while I'm there.
Mr. Vidal, you once wrote that the decline of America began on that day in 1986 when the United States went from being a creditor nation to a debtor nation. Since that time, do you believe you have seen the decline continue?
Oh, yes. Look at the prices of things. There is no inflation. We are assured this by our government. Everything costs more than it did. We've added zeros, you know. When I first published my first novel in 1946, it cost $2.50. It's about $25 for a modest-sized novel. This inflation has gone on and on and on, and nobody's supposed to talk about it. So we pretend that nothing has changed. Well, everything has changed. Everything costs more. A millionaire, as we know, is, you know, a despicably poor person, and really should come in, you know, the back door, or maybe get a job peeling potatoes. But if you don't have a unit, which is 100 million, you're not really well-to-do. I know at least 7 billion achieved this great wealth. The money is just, I don't know, they seem to be printing it. And then, of course, everything is on celluloid now. I have a daydream. Now I'm in Martin Luther King mode. I have a daydream. One day they're going to ask for everybody to pay off their credit card bill. That'll be the end of the American Empire.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gore Vidal will be signing books in the lobby.
Gore Vidal won the National Book Award in 1993 for his collected essays, United States. His most recent book, The Smithsonian Institution, a novel, is available from Harcourt Brace Trade Publishers. "48 hours of nonfiction books on TV,